Now, for a discussion on resetting Africa's economies for new opportunities, please welcome President of MeTL Group, Mohammed Dewji, Co-founder, Tofino Capital and Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council, Aubrey Hruby, Chairman of Orango Investment Corporation, Paulo Gomes. Joining them on stage is Semafor Africa Managing Editor, Alexis Akwagyiram.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this panel. This is Africa's economies resetting for new opportunities. So I think logically it makes sense to start with where we are right now. We're coming off the back of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, a stronger dollar, rising interest rates, and all of this has made the debt burden much heavier for many African countries. We've seen Zambia and Chad restructuring their debt. Ghana is now in talks with the IMF and is having issues as well. I want to start with you, Paulo, and just ask you, what can be done to handle this debt crisis?
Well, this is a difficult moment for many of African countries. We have done well for many years. I think it's important in this spirit of resetting to clearly also make things clear. There hasn't been some bad management of debt for many African countries. We are not in the cycle of the HIPC when the World Bank was put in place the process with IMF to the debt relief. I had the privilege to be at the World Bank at that time. There was many mistakes for many African countries. The debt we have now today is not a product of excess debt for consumption. We have used, many of our countries use the debt, the borrowing for infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we still need to discuss about the size of our GDP. Because when you do the ratios about saying, oh, Africa, the size of the GDP, you're so indebted, there is rebasing that needs to be done. But as you know, in terms of the debt, the issue is not just how you spend the money. It's not about the size of your GDP, but also essentially an issue of your ability to pay your debt, your service. And that's the issue. We are not mobilizing enough resources domestically, and also many of these countries have to pay their debt in dollars. So I think it's very important to put that back into the context. Now, we came out from two major shocks. The one is the COVID, the second, the war in Ukraine, and also because we need to borrow for infrastructure. If you don't invest into infrastructure, you look at a country like Norway. I was in Norway a few weeks ago. 5 million people. And you see the size of the country, there's infrastructure everywhere. So you look at it and you say, is this country really need this volume of infrastructure with 5 million people? Well, they have done it because they could afford, certainly, but they built all this infrastructure because they needed to export. It's a country that needs to export. So they have invested. And I think sometimes beyond just the normal size of investment you need to do, they knew that this is a long term. For many of our countries, you need to invest in road, water. So I think the way this debt has to be solved, has to be dealt with, is I think the Bretton Woods institution will need to think outside the box again. Secondly, to look at the debt that's been used to finance energy and road and infrastructure and find a way to restructure that. So that will be my recommendation about dealing with this issue.
And just a quick follow-up. What role will multilaterals play in this?
This is an opportunity for this Biden administration to have a very frank discussion with Africa. The international financial architecture needs to be reviewed. The institution that's been created in 1947 has been created essentially to deal with the construction of Europe and what we call now developed country. It hasn't been designed to address our issues as Africans. So we need to go to the process of reviewing the Bretton Woods institution. And I think if the Biden administration want to send a signal that they are doing things differently for a new Africa with a new generation, there have been all these comments about the youth and everything. We need to review the Bretton Woods institution. We need to find a way for IMF to play a role much more strategic, for example, on climate change, and use some of the the instruments like the SDR to finance adaptation and even conservation. I can mention about the issue of conservation later on, but I think we need a total review of the Bretton Woods institution and the international financial architecture.
Well, a total review sounds perfect for a reset. And I love your mention of youth, which is an important point because come 2050, something like 1 in 4 people on the planet are going to be African. Aubrey, I wanted to bring you in on this because if we're going to reset, then the question is what happens next? Specifically, I want to ask, how do we make African economies more resilient? And just hold on, before you jump in on that, I wanted us to draw on some Gallup data that we have. We have some slides, as I understand it, that just point to the extent to which young adults are largely pessimistic about economies. If the slide's available, if not, we can go straight to answering that question. Okay, well, actually, there we go, there we go. So, I mean, looking at that, as far as I can see, aside from the top 5, there is a lot of pessimism there among young adults in terms of whether or not they believe that their local economies are improving. And this was young adults aged 15 to 29, and that's from 2021. So I suspect things aren't necessarily getting better with high inflation, the cost of living going up massively. So, Aubrey, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I think the same data would show in the US.
Okay.
If you ask young people about where it's going. And it's mixed to me, right?
Yeah.
And it's not surprising. Young people should be upset, right? 1 million Africans turn 18 every month. Every month while we're sitting here. So we're talking 12 million Africans every year enter the labor force looking for a livelihood, a job, a way to reach their aspirations. And fundamentally, less than 10% of that is created as real jobs, informal jobs, right? So what do the rest of them do? And this comes to some of the points you brought up earlier. The rest of them are absorbed in the informal market. And I just came back from Lagos just a couple weeks ago, and I'm absolutely convinced, and I'm sure Mo will have data on Tanzania as well, that the informal economy is twice the size of the formal economy. And that's why there is more resilience. So I don't think it's a reset moment. I think we've been in a process of resetting for 20 years. Because as Paulo said, we're not going back to the 80s, the lost decade for Africa. No, you saw in the 2014, 2015, 2016 commodity price slam, when you saw both Nigeria and South Africa go into recession, they bounced back by 2017. They did not lose a decade. Mm-hmm. Same, and if you just isolate COVID, the African countries, their growth shrunk, but they didn't go negative as a whole, but they shrunk pretty dramatically down to less than 2% growth, right? But developed markets shrunk by 6.5%. But then at the same time, they bounced back in 2021, right before the impact of Ukraine. So the underlying macroeconomy, because of investment in infrastructure, because of a diversification of partners, because of increasing interregional trade, and because of the pure engrossing nature of the informal market, has meant that African countries are already more resilient, and we're seeing that. What's not been resilient and changing is people's mindsets about investing in Africa. And that's the problem, that we live in a very static, very old and outdated risk perception of the region. And so I think if we could get that to reset, we would see dramatic change.
So we're looking for global investors to reset their mindset. Is that it, essentially?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, there is another issue that's related to the way in which economies are performed, which is we've seen food inflation skyrocketing, and largely that has been off the back of, well, supply chain shocks from the pandemic, and then also for the Ukraine war, the price of gasoline, diesel, and fertilizer in particular going up. We have a video question that's come in that's related to food security. So we can play that video, and then Mo, I would love to get you in to answer that question that's been posed that we've got coming in.
Hello, my name is John Shikatano with Pangea Global Ventures, based in New York, but currently in Freetown, Sierra Leone. My question is, what are the opportunities and barriers to investments in food security and agriculture?
Nice. So before I respond to your question on food security, you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war. Yes. And the impact that is created. I like to break things down. We look at Africa, we have 1.2 billion people, 2.3 trillion GDP. But if you were to take out countries like Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and a little bit of South Africa, you have an Africa where per capita income is $1,200. So you're talking about $100. Now, out of $100 a month, people use 70% of that disposable on food.
Yeah.
Now, when this crisis happened, prices of wheat, fertilizer, edible oils, fuel doubled 2.5 times. So what happened in reality was the guy who was spending $70 could ideally just buy food worth $35. And this was catastrophic for Africa, because you're talking about simple ingredient of food and nutrition. And if you look at Africa, we have 40%, 50% of arable land. The question is that we've seen Asia made a green revolution, China moving towards that direction, the US, whether it's soybean or wheat. Why has Africa not moved forward in investing in proper commercial agriculture? And one, I think we Africans sometimes, we politicize land issues. But from the map, you can see there's tons of land and there are no people around. So then there's an issue of perception. And because you need tons, I'm working on a fund that's $1 billion plus fund on agri. And I want to give you an example. So I am into agriculture and I grow sisal. A little bit of background on sisal. Sisal is a natural fiber that was predominantly used in the shipping industry for ropes and twines. And today it's been used in, automobile industries, in the building industry. But now I happen to be the largest sisal producer in the world out of Tanzania. So it's not that it's not possible. It is possible, but it requires tons of capital. It requires a reset of perception and mindset of the world and foreign investment that is coming into Africa. And of course, we as Africans have to kind of not politicize land issues as much. So I think it's very important, and that we need to, I think this has to be the future so that we get out of these problems of our people suffering of food inflation.
Both of you have referred to the need for a shift, a resetting of the mindset of global investors. But how is that going to happen?
Look at Mo's the largest exporter of sisal in the world out of Tanzania.
How can we have more Mo's?
That alone can help. Those success cases can and will help change. But also all of us in this room, because we are at the beginning of a long week. There'll probably be 40 different events on Africa business in this course of this week. And yet we will all see each other again and again and again. So it means collectively, we need to each be an ambassador for this effort outside of the rooms. And it might mean not going to Africa-specific events, but rather going to agriculture events or showing up at, shipbuilding events or something of that sort, where you're showing the Africa opportunity to a room full of sectoral experts who understand the fundamentals of that business. I think for too long, we've had the Africa world and Africa business area in the corner. You Africa people, go talk to yourselves or talk to your things. But it's time that we then go and, Paulo's been doing it on infrastructure and, Minister Hart on green and, going to different places and really doing the sector sell. I remember when Mimi Alamayo was at OPIC, they were doing experiments of doing road shows across the US, not saying, come listen to Africa opportunities, but saying, come listen to agriculture opportunities. And then later on telling them it was in Africa.
And also, it's about knowing the African risk.
Mm-hmm.
Many people don't know the African risk. It's not about taking the classical measure of it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know the African risk, and this is what we have to show other people. The second thing, that's the reason why this kind of summit is important. We need capital. And we don't want to be caught into geopolitics. When you need capital, you have to go and find capital where it exists. So I think it's also an opportunity to show the people that's why Africa doesn't want to get into the fight of the China, the US, in England, everything, because we need capital. Okay. Now, there are a lot of things that we have done with the Chinese that hasn't been well structured, I've seen. And I think we have learned our lesson. I don't think now many African countries will go in a project with China without having an investment bank with him, a lawyer, and then you do a proper negotiation. That was our fault. I think this thing of constantly pointing the finger to others is not an issue of the Chinese. It was our problem because we haven't put a proper framework to negotiate. So we need capital, and people have to send this message.
But on the geopolitical side, what I do think is relevant is that Europeans and Americans, when they talk about African opportunities, they always start from a lens of risk. Always. They first start thinking like, what about corruption? What about this?
Mo
what about
shaking his
that?
head. Mo, do you want to jump in? Time's not on our side.
I believe that, look, we have the economy, we have the land, we have the workforce, we have the market with Africa Trade Agreement now. You can be sending anything. So you can potentially do grains, wheat, corn, soybean, sunflower, and proteins. And you have Africa to feed, and you have the world to feed. So I think there is an opportunity that is clear and simple in front of us.
Sadly, I can see you're all poised, you're coiled, ready to go, but we're going to have to call it a day. Time is not on our side. I would say thank you so much. Our takeaways are we can harness the importance of the informal economy, always have a lawyer with you. I think that's clearly important. A cheap one, ideally. And we need a global mindset reset from global investors. Thank you so much for your time. It's greatly appreciated.